And so we are literally in the process of deconditioning, of taking all that stuff off and saying, okay, who am I really? And to do that with love and with compassion, because that's really the only way through. It wasn't intended for us to beat ourselves up and to hate on other people and hate on ourselves. It was always the intention to love.
You know what? I believe that we underestimate some of our superpowers when we are living our lives and doing negotiation and making a difference. I think a lot of people underestimate love and the power of it. Ame-lia, I would love to know, as you work with indigenous tribes and you do negotiations, how much does that come into play in how you carry yourself and how things pan out?
I I want to clarify, I don't necessarily do negotiations, but I do work with Indigenous community and work a lot with bringing them together with diverse, multiple stakeholders that are not of their worldview. When we meet and we're trying to bridge worldviews, there's a lot of defensive mechanisms at play and protective mechanisms. And all of that is really a result of our old traumas or this need to protect ourselves. And often it's in the room unconsciously. So where love comes in is if we can really set up a space where people feel safe to be as they are and to make mistakes and to be wherever they are on the journey and to hold compassion around that. Because there can be a lot of judgment, a lot of expectation for people to be a certain way. And as soon as that is present, people shut down. So love is about loving ourselves in that space. It's also about loving the others that we are sitting with, knowing that we're all doing the best we can in any given moment. And when we see behaviors that we don't love, that's really fear present. That's unhealed trauma present. It's not the core of who that being is in front of you.
How do you open up that conversation so that they're more open actually to talking about things that a lot of people consider are soft topics, but they're really the underlying topics of why things break down? So, how do you open up that conversation even?
Yeah. Well, why use a circle? So we sit literally in
Mm.
circle in chairs. And that in and of itself is a way to break down barriers between people because there's no table in between us. It can be a very vulnerable space for people to sit in. So, what I like to do when we start these conversations is to put agreements in the room. And for me, agreements are really like a way to set our collective intention for how we want to be together. So, one of those agreements is to love ourselves unconditionally. And I always preface it with, like, okay, you might not hear this in all your business meetings or all your interactions, but we're going to go here because it's so important to um, embrace and knowing that we're not going to do it perfectly if we truly want to hear each other. And the only way we're going to get to a resolution is if we can hear one another. And often all that other stuff just gets in the way and we start misinterpreting things. And so, yeah, it's through agreements. We bring it in and I ask everyone if they're okay with that. And then we step in and I find that in and of itself just shifts the energy of the space.
So, you walk in to these circles, you're not on anyone's side per se.
No,
What
no.
you what you're working on is to pull out of them their congruencies versus their differences.
Yes, and also to honor the differences and what they can add to the conversation and add to the solution. I will say, although I'm not on anyone's side, I'm very passionate about lifting up the voices that are not heard or have not been heard. And so, working between Indigenous and non Indigenous communities, we've really built up our muscles of the non Indigenous Western world. And collectively, as a world, as a society, we're building our muscle to really understand the perspective, the worldview of Indigenous people. And so, although I'm not on anybody's side, I certainly create a lot of space for those Indigenous communities to, um, say what needs to be said, hold their ground, have a voice in those spaces.
I love what you're saying, Amelia, because there's so much of mentality in our world in general where it's us versus them.
Mhm.
And a lot of people don't think of using love as a way of bridging gaps and really opening up conversations so that people can see each other, like genuinely see who the other human being that is sitting across from them. Have you ever had, I guess, places where you weren't able to reach them? And what did you do in those cases?
Mm. Yeah, I've been in a couple circumstances where um, people's defensive mechanisms were up and they stayed up. And um, what I tend to do in those circumstances is really just see them for where they're at, to honor what I'm seeing. And I do that by giving voice to it. Like I know you're agitated right now. I can see that in you. I can see that this is not a comfortable place for you. And that is okay. And we're going to carry on with this meeting. And so, what is it that you need to do for you in this moment to be present or to take care of yourself in the most loving way possible? And maybe that's leaving the meeting. Sometimes that is for people. Sometimes it's taking a few deep breaths. And so I really give the agency back to that person, because when people get activated, it's often because they don't feel they have agency. And I always want to make sure people are at choice 100% of the time. Yeah.
I love that you are going through this step and explaining it so well, because even though you're dealing with various tribes, this applies to individuals in their normal everyday of when they're not able to connect with someone, to be able to find a way to actually reach them and see their perspective and share their perspective, or get up and walk away if they cannot figure it out at that moment, instead of escalating it to spots that they don't need to. What was it like for you as you began this journey and this type of work to come from a loving perspective?
I love this question. It was difficult in the beginning. I Because I was acting out of my own unconscious fear most of the time. I was just showing up as I was. Conversations activated me, and then I acted on that activation unconsciously. I put it right back out into the circle or into the conversation. And in the moment and over time, that just wasn't okay with me. I really wanted to advance my skills. There's also just um, moments of humility that need to be expected on this journey. So to walk into these situations and know that I don't know everything and nobody is expecting me to know anything, and that is okay. So I think I wanted to come in with perfection and I wanted to do it right. I didn't want to let people down. And the way in which I showed up was often defensive because I needed to prove a point to somebody, like probably my dad, but my dad's not in the room. So it really is a journey of self learning. And I've become a better facilitator, a stronger facilitator because of all the personal work that I've done. And I had a lot of beautiful teachers in the community that were brave enough to sit down with me and say, what you just said was really insulting, or the way in
Mm.
which you just showed up, you just alienated this whole group of people over here. Those words are hard to hear, but those are gold, because by taking that feedback, it's allowed me to be a much more powerful facilitator.
I love that you're saying this thing again where ego didn't step in for
Mm,
you to fight back, but to actually listen to the input and the feedback, because no one walks into any sort of life and knows everything that the other person is living and going through.
Yeah.
How have you expanded yourself as a loving person? And I'm using that term on purpose because you continue to work with a variety of individuals. You are also taking on the role of coaching, and I'm going to use your word, gladiators, to march on with their lives to the better versions of them. So, how are you using love, which some people might think is a soft skill,
Mm.
as a way to actually bridge these pieces for people to hear you?
Mm. Yeah, beautiful. When I talk about love and when I think about gladiators, those folks out there that are really changing the world, doing the hard work to step into situations they're not familiar with and be willing to grow along with everybody so that we can actually create a new world. Those people have so much courage. And the French root of the word courage is heart. It's the word coeur, which is a French word that means heart. And so I do really think that courage is love. And I don't think it's often thought about in that way. I think we can tend to be thinking about, like, even if you think about a gladiator, you might think about this sweaty, dirty man in an arena that's fighting a war or fighting something. And that's been our model of the world and looking at the world and what it takes to be the change for a really long time. But we're in this point of transition where we're really bringing in the feminine energy, the feminine aspects, and and seeing things like love, which weren't accepted in those other spaces, as courageous, as brave. Um, and so that is the way that I like to talk about it, because still a lot of the people that I work with are women, but they've grown up and gone honed their own work. What am I trying to say? They've honed their own skills in a very masculine environment, which often required them to put on that armor. And so we are literally in the process of deconditioning, of taking all that stuff off and saying, okay, who am I really? And to do that with love and with compassion, because that's really the only way through. It wasn't intended for us to beat ourselves up and to hate on other people and hate on ourselves. It was always the intention to love. And I think we're just in that period of seeing that and figuring out how do we do that, because we have so much conditioning in our bodies that prevent us from seeing those ways of being.
What took you down this path? I'm always fascinated to understand how someone arrives at a certain thing in their lives.
It's a good question. Many roots. I think one is in my childhood house of origin. Um, there was a lot of love, but there was a lot of tumultuousness too. There was addiction, there was fighting, there was divorce, there was a message also that for me it was better for me to be seen than heard.
Mm.
And so I've spent my life sort of unpacking all of that, finding my voice, and working through the the protective mechanisms that I created as a kid to really find who my authentic self it was. But the instigator for that journey was actually a really painful part in my life where my father had just passed away and I was breaking up with the third long-term relationship I had been in a very similar pattern to what I had done in the past. And I had so much pain, so much grief in my body, and I just didn't want to keep doing this. I didn't want to keep living this life. I didn't want to keep blaming my partners, blaming the world, blaming everybody else for the pain that I was feeling. And so that moment was what got me onto the journey of really looking with inward. And it started with a multi-year immersion program with Gary Zukav. And he was the one that really taught me that we're either coming from love or we're coming from fear.
Mm.
And he gave us the skills to really recognize in our body when we were acting from either place and to give ourselves the power back to choose love over fear to the best of our ability in any circumstance. So that responsibility changed everything for me. It deepened my connection to everybody in my life. I had much more authentic relationships. I had more intimacy. I had more joy. And I was more aware than ever of my purpose and what I was here for. On that journey, I also had a cancer diagnosis. And when you get diagnosed with cancer and you get to face your own mortality, things get really real all of a sudden. And what the cancer journey allowed me to do was do more trauma healing in my life, not only from the cancer, but looking back at my childhood. And when I did that healing, I just saw the world through this trauma informed lens of, wow, we all have unhealed trauma. And that trauma is holding these protective mechanisms in place. And that's kind of how we're interacting on that society. And we built a world around that. And I thought, if we're going to bring peace and love and joy to this world, which is what I am super passionate about, we have to do the deeper work of getting to know ourselves and coming together and doing it together collectively. Um, so, yeah, it's been a journey, a lifelong journey to get me to here and doing the work that I'm up to right now. Yeah.
The fact that you had to face your own mortality.
Mm.
I know I've lived through part of that journey with my sister as she went through her own journey of cancer. What were some of the personal superpowers that you relied on or you built to grow through that stress? Because right now you're cancer free, right?
I am. Yes.
So, what were some of the superpowers that you've learned to build yourself for yourself to get
Mm.
through that journey?
Yeah. There's two that come to mind off the top of my head. One was the gift of being able to receive.
Mm.
So, up until that moment, I was very independent and very proud of that. And I lived by myself at the time, and my family was all on the other side of the country. And there were many moments in that journey that were absolutely terrifying, where I wasn't really sure I was going to make it through the night. And in those moments, for me, there was no other choice but to reach out and get over all of these stories that receiving help is not okay. It makes me weak and all of those things. And so it was kind of like, not forced upon me. It was actually a gift. Like I really think I wanted and needed that lesson. And that was one way that I got to really jump in like with all feet, with all my feet. Yeah. Um, and then the other thing that really happened on that journey, although I had spiritual practices before, I really deepened my relationship with universal energy, divine spirit, and God, and needed to do that to understand that there was a deeper meaning for why I was going through this. And for me, I really do think I asked for this journey in many ways. Like my body, my soul was asking for it because I wanted something more from life. Even though I had done all that personal work and done the deep dives, I was still missing something. And what I was missing was like living my purpose every single day and being able to tap into a spirit, a higher power allowed me to stay trusting and knowing that everything that I was going through was here to serve me. So those are the two things that actually support me so much today and allow me to do the work that I do and be the person I am. Um, yeah.
I know there's a lot of wonderful individuals, I'm going to say individuals, not females, that go through that journey of fearing for their life all of a sudden.
Mm,
And instead of turning inward, they become angry
mm,
instead of taking radical responsibility. And you did that in your previous stuff and in this. And that's really the key to a lot of it is that responsibility. And I say that to some of my students sometimes. And the first thing they say, well, what about the negatives? As I go, especially the stuff that you think is negative. So
yeah,
I love hearing that from you, that
yeah.
the responsibility part, knowing that you don't walk the journey alone. None of this is
Mm,
meant to be alone. When we talk about love, and when I asked to even be on this podcast talking about love, where people sometimes think it's a soft skill, it's actually one of the strongest skills, is to be
mhm.
able to love yourself and others through their journeys. What would you like to create as you're moving forward with your coaching, with your retreats, and helping these gladiators? What is it that you'd like to see as individuals, each one of them grow into?
It's a beautiful question. I I hope they grow into themselves. And I think that journey is also one of the most courageous journeys we can take because it really requires no longer following the shoulds, like the paths that we are on for the reasons that most of us don't even know or are not even conscious of most of the time. But when we are following the path that we came into this lifetime to experience, like nothing gets in our way. And so, what I really hope for these gladiators that come together in the program and the retreat is that they find themselves again and that they create an environment around them in those environments, but also in their lives where they allow others to also find themselves. Because I do believe that to be a change maker, it's those everyday little moments. It's how you show up in the grocery store. It's how you show up with your kid. It's how you show up with your mom that really create the change. It's not about being on stages or having millions of dollars or all of that. I mean, and all that stuff is great and needed also. But gladiators to me are everyday people who make a decision to do the work, to be the best version of themselves that they can, and to share that with the world. Yeah.
It takes a lot of work
Yeah.
to delve into ourselves and really figure out the individuals that we are intended to be.
Mm,
And I see you doing that all the time with our different things that we touch on. And as we move forward and you're continuing to grow, what are some of the things that you still struggle with so that people don't look at us and go, well, they got it all figured out? For
mm,
real, for people to understand that we're going through our own journeys as we put things out there and as we put a hand out and a hand up to somebody else. What are some of the things that you struggle with that you know that you're going to get through at some point anyway?
mm. Yeah. Beautiful. I love this conversation. First of all, I love being surrounded by you, Rima, and that you're doing this work of bringing love to the world. I still struggle with knowing that I'm enough, and I have a tendency to want to sign up for the next course or do the next training or get certified or read the next book. And what I'm noticing is all of that is also a protective mechanism to keep me safe, to keep me from just fully stepping out on the stages as me, and that is enough. To me, that's an old childhood wound. And I actually just listened to this TED talk by this man who had this conversation with his 2-year-old son. And he wanted his son to dress up for Halloween. And his son was like, no, I'm not going to. And he's like, why? And the son said, because I want to be me. And this moment like changed this father's life forever because it evolved into this moment where it was very intense, and the father was like, don't be a disappointment, I need you to put this costume on. And he said, when is it going to be okay, Dad, that I just be me?
That is brilliant. I've never heard it said that way.
Yeah.
And how true
Yeah.
that we do that to kids and to each other, that you have to
Yeah.
show up as something else to
Totally.
be accepted.
Yeah.
And when we start to talk about love, honestly, we start to open up the conversations of how do you see me? How do you hear me? Are you seeing me? Are you
Mm-hmm.
really hearing me? Because what I find the toughest part is people making the assumption of what someone else is going to think, what someone else is going to do. It's like, wow, are you a magician? How do you do that? Instead of
Yeah.
being more open to asking and really knowing what the other individual is all about. And that's what I love about you is you're not afraid to do talks on this. You're not afraid to do programs on this. You're not afraid to have talks on this and really open up the conversation. And you do go into areas that most people would consider they're hostile to each other,
Mm.
taking you back to the circles. You sit them down together and open up the conversation. And really, what's flowing is that magic of love for people to see each other. What is the best way for people to connect with you, Ame-lia?
Mm. They can go to my website. It's hum consulting.ca. And I also have a podcast. It's called Circle of Change. And you can find it same website /podcast at the end. And it's also on all the podcast channels. The podcast is a great way just to be in conversation with me and learn about, yeah, what is required to be a change maker, to really be held and seen in that space. I love that you talked about being seen, because it's a basic human need, actually, and we're really good, I think, at meeting our physical needs, and we're kind of okay with meeting our spiritual needs, but our emotional needs, which is that need to be seen, to be loved, our society is growing in that way. And so I love that you're out there as a light leader, like really helping us with that journey. And so, yeah, so the circle of change, we get into those topics too. And I'd love for anybody to join me there.
Actually, I would love for you to elaborate on some of the episodes that you loved in your own podcast, because that is the next thing that I really desire to learn about more, how you go in depth. Because I find, honestly, I love doing the podcast and connecting with individuals. I find that I'm learning so much. I'm growing. I'm healing by hearing someone else's input. So, what's it like you doing the podcast? And what are some of the memorable things that you've gotten out of it?
Mm, I love it. It's been such a beautiful journey, the podcast. I mean, for me, it was me stepping into really finding my voice and being courageous enough to put it out there, regardless. And you know that journey. Yeah. And and I've grown just in doing that. It's been 2 years now that we've been up and running. I even find the quality of my voice has changed over the years, which is really interesting to observe. The conversations with other people. So I do solo episodes and I do interviews as well. And the conversations with others are so juicy because really it's a conversation where I am just getting to know them and where they just get to be themselves and share whatever wisdom they have for us. And the guests often tend to discover something about themselves that maybe they didn't know before. And that's just because of the space that I like to create with folks. I like the intimacy of it. There's been so many nuggets. A person that we both admire, Sean Smith, was just on my podcast, Circle of Change, and he dropped so many nuggets. But the one that is sticking with me right now is that the importance of each and every one of us finding that thing that we that is just pulling us, that we have no choice but to release out into the world, and the meaning and depth that that adds to our lives. um he talked about so many things. That's interesting that that's the one that's sticking with me. But the other nugget came from an ex-police officer. I interviewed 3 ex-police officers, and they're all doing this beautiful work right now, um, helping first responder organizations with the unhealed trauma in their organizations through meditation and mindfulness practices and counseling. It's amazing. But when I asked them, what does it mean to be the change? Les Sylvan responded by saying, to be gentle and relentless about bringing the light. And that phrase has stuck with me. It's pierced my heart because I believe in its truth so much. And it also just gives this beautiful vision of how it is we show up in the world. Yeah.
You
Those
pierced
are a
through
couple
my
of things.
heart with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, before I ask my last question, is
Yeah.
there anything that you would like to say that I didn't get to ask you?
Oh. Mm. I think that one of the pieces that's coming out of some of the research that I'm doing on what it requires to be the change, there's so many nuggets in there that I love and that made sense to me. The one that I found really interesting was that gladiators, changemakers are here to learn and then share what they learn with the world. And although I've heard that from other leaders that I follow, I wasn't clear that that was like a common characteristic of people that change the world. They're the people that have taken the time and energy to develop, do their own personal development, and be so jazzed about what they experience through that that they want to share it with the world. And so um, that's just something I want to say. And I think it relates to what Sean was saying in our interview together was it's like we're all learning, but it's not just meant for us. Like what we learn is actually not meant for us. And if we could think about that, that's when we become powerful change makers. But it requires vulnerability. It requires us being able to uh, share maybe personal aspects of our lives and what we've been learning, and to say that, oh, I'm not actually perfect, but hey, I've learned this great thing and I hope it can give you freedom too. Um, that was something that's just sticking with me in this moment right now.
Thank you for saying all of that.
Yeah.
If I put you on a stage and gave you a microphone where every human being in this planet is able to hear you, what would you like to say to them?
Surround yourself with people that love you and see you, and don't be scared to share your story, because in your story is your purpose, and your purpose was meant to be shared with the world. So, yeah, that's what's coming to me.
Thank you. I truly appreciate you and everything that you're doing. Keep being the change maker and the light worker that you are. We're needed everywhere. Thank you for being that. And for you viewers, please remember our attitude always determines our altitude and how we show up in life. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you in the next episode.